Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling strangely unsettled, not because someone said too much, but because they barely said anything at all? Why is it that the loudest person in the room often feels easier to understand than the one who simply watches? Think about the people you've met who rarely interrupt, who reveal almost nothing about themselves, who seem perfectly comfortable letting silence stretch, while everyone else rushes to fill it. Most of us instinctively interpret quietness as harmlessness. We assume that people who speak less have less influence, fewer ambitions, weaker opinions, or smaller emotional worlds. It's one of the oldest shortcuts the human brain takes. We are wired to judge what we can easily observe, and words are observable. Silence isn't. So the mind quietly fills in the blanks, usually with comforting assumptions. But what if those assumptions are exactly what makes silence so powerful? The truth is that quiet people are not dangerous because they are secretly plotting against everyone around them. That stereotype belongs in fiction, not reality. They're dangerous in a much subtler, far more psychologically significant way. They are difficult to predict. And the human brain has always feared what it cannot confidently predict. Imagine two strangers entering a room. One immediately begins talking about where they work, what they like, what annoys them, what they did last weekend. Within minutes, your brain has built a working model of that person. It may not be accurate, but it feels complete enough to reduce uncertainty. Now imagine the second stranger answers politely, smiles occasionally, asks thoughtful questions, but offers almost nothing personal in return. Something unusual begins to happen. Instead of learning about them, your own mind starts inventing explanations. Are they shy, intelligent, arrogant, anxious, judgmental, bored, friendly? The fascinating part is that different observers create completely different stories using the exact same behavior. The quiet person becomes a psychological mirror reflecting other people's expectations, insecurities, and biases. While everyone believes they are evaluating the quiet individual, they are unknowingly revealing themselves instead. This is one reason silence holds an influence that words often cannot. When information is missing, the brain desperately tries to complete the picture. Psychologists call this our discomfort with uncertainty. The mind evolved to detect patterns because survival depended on predicting what came next. Our ancestors who misjudged another person's intentions risked losing resources, alliances, or even their lives. That ancient machinery still operates beneath modern conversations. Every unanswered question creates a tiny amount of cognitive tension, and tension demands resolution. This is why people often overshare around someone who barely speaks. They mistake attentive silence for emotional safety. They keep talking because the absence of interruption feels like acceptance. In reality, the quiet listener may simply be observing. And observation is a form of power that rarely announces itself. Consider what happens during an argument. Most people instinctively defend themselves. They explain, justify, interrupt, raise their voices, or rush to correct misunderstandings. Each reaction exposes information. It reveals emotional triggers, personal values, hidden fears, priorities, and vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the person who remains calm and says very little learns far more than they reveal. This imbalance creates an asymmetry of knowledge. One side becomes increasingly transparent while the other remains largely unreadable. In psychology, information itself functions as a resource. The more accurately you understand another person's motivations while protecting your own, the greater your ability to anticipate behavior. That's not manipulation by default. Skilled negotiators, experienced investigators, effective leaders, and emotionally intelligent friends all rely on careful observation before speaking. Yet because our culture often celebrates constant expression, we underestimate the immense advantage of selective communication. Interestingly, this has almost nothing to do with intelligence alone. Some of the smartest people you'll ever meet are remarkably talkative. Some quiet people have very little insight at all. Silence itself is not wisdom. The real distinction lies in self-regulation. Remaining quiet when everyone expects an immediate reaction requires resisting one of the brain's strongest social impulses, the need to reduce uncertainty through speech. We often speak not because we have something valuable to say, but because silence makes us uncomfortable. Think about awkward pauses in elevators, first dates, business meetings, classrooms, even family dinners. Someone almost always rushes to fill the gap. Why? Because silence forces attention inward. Without conversation, we become more aware of our own thoughts, anxieties, and assumptions. Talking relieves that discomfort. Quiet people who genuinely tolerate silence without panic possess an unusual emotional advantage. They aren't being mysterious for dramatic effect. Often, they've simply developed a greater tolerance for internal experience. And people who can tolerate their own minds without constant distraction often notice things everyone else misses. They detect inconsistencies between words and facial expressions. They remember details others discard. They recognize emotional shifts before they become obvious. Not because they possess supernatural perception, but because attention is a limited resource. While others spend it producing responses, they invest it in gathering information. Over time, this difference compounds in ways that are almost invisible. Every unnoticed hesitation, every contradiction, every change in tone becomes another piece of a much larger psychological puzzle. Most people never realize they're being understood more deeply than they understand the person sitting quietly across from them, and that imbalance changes every interaction long before either person says another word. The strange irony is that the more openly someone performs their personality, the easier they become to navigate. Human beings leak information constantly. We imagine that we reveal ourselves only when we intentionally share secrets, but our minds advertise far more than we notice. The jokes we laugh at, the stories we repeat, the complaints we can't stop making, the compliments we instinctively give, the topics we avoid, the speed of our speech, the way our eyes move when certain names are mentioned. All of these are tiny psychological fingerprints. None of them seem important on their own, yet together they create an astonishingly accurate portrait of how we think. Quiet people are not exempt from these signals, but because they produce fewer of them, they create less data for others to analyze. That doesn't make them impossible to understand. It simply means understanding them requires patience, and patience is surprisingly rare. Most people decide who someone is within minutes, then spend the rest of the relationship searching for evidence that confirms their first impression. This tendency, known in psychology as confirmation bias, quietly shapes friendships, hiring decisions, romantic relationships, and even courtroom judgments. Once the brain believes it has solved someone, it stops investigating. But quiet individuals often disrupt this process because there isn't enough evidence to build a satisfying conclusion. The mind dislikes unfinished stories, so it begins writing one on its own. Sometimes the quiet person becomes the nicest person here. Other times they become the most intimidating. In reality, neither judgment came from the quiet individual. Both were created inside the observer's own mind. This is where silence becomes unexpectedly influential. People don't merely react to who quiet individuals are, they react to who they imagine them to be. That imagined version can carry enormous emotional weight. Think about your own life. Was there ever someone who barely spoke, yet whose opinions somehow mattered more than everyone else's? Maybe it was a parent who didn't need to raise their voice because one disappointed glance carried more force than an hour-long lecture. Maybe it was a teacher whose silence after reading your work felt more intimidating than criticism. Maybe it was a manager who listened through an entire meeting before offering a single sentence that completely changed the direction of the discussion. Why do those moments stay with us? Because uncertainty magnifies significance. When feedback is constant, the brain adapts. But when someone speaks rarely, every word appears more intentional. Scarcity changes perceived value. Economists describe this principle in markets, but the human mind applies it to attention as well. Endless talking lowers the perceived importance of individual statements. Selective speech does the opposite. This doesn't mean quiet people are automatically profound. Many aren't. But because listeners expect fewer words, they naturally assign greater weight to the words that do appear. This expectation creates a fascinating psychological illusion. The speaker may have spent only a few seconds forming a thought, while everyone else spends hours analyzing it afterward. You've probably experienced this in reverse. Imagine receiving a one-word text message from someone who usually writes long paragraphs. Suddenly your mind races. Are they upset? Busy? Disappointed? Did something happen? The message itself didn't change nearly as much as the context surrounding it. Silence transforms interpretation. It stretches meaning far beyond the original signal. Our brains evolved this sensitivity for good reason. Throughout human history, subtle changes in another person's behavior often signaled important shifts in alliances, threats, or intentions. Someone who suddenly stopped speaking around the campfire might have noticed danger before anyone else. Someone unusually quiet during a negotiation might be reconsidering trust. Even today, experienced investigators often pay closer attention to what people omit than to what they explicitly say. Not because silence proves deception, it doesn't, but because omissions can reveal priorities. What people consistently avoid discussing often tells us where emotional significance lives. The same principle applies internally. Many quiet people are not silent because they have nothing to say. They're silent because an extraordinary amount is happening before anything reaches their lips. Modern neuroscience suggests that the brain is constantly predicting, evaluating, filtering, and simulating possible outcomes before action occurs. Some individuals externalize much of this process through conversation. They think aloud. Others perform more of that processing internally. Neither style is inherently superior, but they create dramatically different social impressions. The person who verbalizes every thought appears transparent, spontaneous, and emotionally accessible. The person who processes privately appears controlled, distant, or mysterious, even when neither impression is entirely accurate. This misunderstanding explains why quiet people are so frequently underestimated. Society often mistakes visibility for capability. We naturally notice confidence displayed through speech, yet genuine competence often develops in ways that are almost invisible. An experienced surgeon rarely impresses patients by talking nonstop during an operation. An elite chess player doesn't reveal every strategy before making a move. A seasoned pilot doesn't announce every calculation while landing in turbulent weather. In domains where consequences matter, careful observation usually precedes decisive action. The same pattern quietly appears in everyday relationships. While one person reacts instantly to every emotional impulse, another watches those reactions accumulate over weeks, months, even years, gradually building an internal model that becomes remarkably accurate. And because this process unfolds without dramatic gestures or obvious confrontation, almost nobody notices it happening until the quiet person makes a decision that seems to come out of nowhere, when in reality it was forming long before anyone else realized the pieces were already falling into place. One of the biggest misconceptions about quiet people is the belief that silence reflects emotional emptiness, when in fact the opposite is often true. The human mind has a limited capacity for processing information at any given moment, and every conversation demands attention on multiple levels simultaneously. We listen to the words, interpret tone, monitor facial expressions, predict intentions, regulate our own emotional reactions, and decide what to say next, all within fractions of a second. Most people unconsciously simplify this workload by paying attention to only a few of these layers. But individuals who naturally observe more than they express often distribute their attention differently. Instead of concentrating on producing the next sentence, they devote more cognitive resources to detecting patterns. They notice which coworker becomes unusually enthusiastic whenever recognition is mentioned, but withdraws the moment responsibility enters the discussion. They recognize that a friend insists they're fine, while unconsciously rubbing their hands together, avoiding eye contact, and shortening every answer. They see that someone who constantly claims to value honesty becomes strangely evasive whenever certain topics arise. None of these observations requires supernatural intuition. They're simply the result of sustained attention over time. Human behavior is remarkably consistent once you stop focusing on isolated moments and begin watching recurring patterns. This is precisely why first impressions are often misleading while long-term observation can become astonishingly accurate. The loudest personalities frequently dominate our awareness because movement naturally captures attention. Yet attention and importance are not the same thing. Imagine walking through a forest. Your eyes are immediately drawn to the brightly colored bird darting between branches, but the oldest tree, the one whose roots quietly shape the entire ecosystem, barely demands your notice. Social environments operate in much the same way. Charisma captures attention. Consistency earns understanding. Quiet people often accumulate that understanding gradually, almost invisibly, until they know far more about the emotional landscape of a group than anyone realizes. This creates another psychological effect that can feel almost unsettling. Because they have spent so much time observing, their occasional insights often seem impossibly precise. They mention a fear you never admitted aloud, predict a conflict before it happens, or accurately explain why someone reacted the way they did when everyone else completely misunderstood the situation. To the outside observer, this can look like extraordinary intuition. More often, it's the natural consequence of patient pattern recognition. Our brains are prediction machines. Every experience updates an internal model of how people behave, and the more accurate that model becomes, the easier future behavior is to anticipate. The difference is that many people constantly interrupt this learning process by projecting their own assumptions onto others. They hear only what confirms existing beliefs. Quiet observers, particularly those who genuinely listen without immediately preparing a response, collect cleaner information. They allow contradictions to remain unresolved instead of forcing them into a comfortable narrative. Ironically, this makes them less certain in the short term but more accurate in the long run. That willingness to delay judgment is one of the least appreciated forms of intelligence because it feels passive from the outside while demanding enormous discipline internally. Most of us crave closure. We want to know whether someone is trustworthy, whether a relationship will last, whether a colleague is competent, whether a stranger is kind or dangerous. Ambiguity feels mentally expensive, so the brain rushes to eliminate it. Quiet individuals who resist this urge often appear detached, but what they're really doing is refusing to confuse confidence with certainty. They understand consciously or not, that people reveal themselves through repetition, not performance. Almost anyone can act generous once, patient once, humble once, confident once. Character isn't found in isolated moments. It's hidden inside recurring choices that become visible only after enough time has passed. This patience can make quiet people surprisingly resilient against manipulation. Many forms of manipulation depend on speed. The manipulator creates urgency, emotional intensity, or social pressure, hoping the target will react before carefully evaluating the situation. Whether it's an aggressive salesperson insisting an offer expires today, someone using guilt to force an immediate favor, or a charismatic individual trying to accelerate trust, the underlying mechanism is often the same. Reduce the amount of reflective thinking available. A person comfortable with pausing before responding quietly disrupts this strategy. Silence creates space for the emotional brain to settle and for more deliberate reasoning to return. That pause may last only a few seconds, yet it fundamentally changes decision-making. This doesn't mean every quiet person is impossible to manipulate. No human being is. We all possess emotional blind spots. But the habit of observing before reacting often provides a small psychological buffer that protects against impulsive choices. And perhaps this is where quietness becomes most misunderstood. People sometimes interpret delayed responses as hesitation, weakness, or lack of confidence. In reality, delayed responses can represent something entirely different: the refusal to let another person's emotional tempo dictate one's own thinking. In a world that increasingly rewards immediate opinions, instant replies, and constant visibility, the ability to remain psychologically unhurried has become unexpectedly rare. And because it is rare, it often goes unnoticed until the moment everyone else is caught reacting, while the quiet person, who has been watching all along, responds with a level of clarity that seems almost impossible to those who never realized how much information silence had been collecting in the first place. There is another layer to quietness that most people never consider because it operates beneath conscious awareness. Every social interaction is an exchange of influence. We tend to imagine influence as something active, persuading, arguing, inspiring, leading, but influence also exists in what psychologists sometimes call emotional regulation between people. Our nervous systems are constantly reading one another. A single anxious person can make an entire room feel tense without saying a word. One genuinely calm individual can slowly lower the emotional temperature of a heated discussion simply by refusing to match everyone else's intensity. This happens because human beings are deeply social creatures whose brains continuously monitor the emotional states of those around them. We unconsciously mimic facial expressions, vocal rhythms, posture, and even breathing patterns. It's one reason panic spreads so quickly through crowds and why laughter can become contagious. But the opposite is equally true. Someone who remains emotionally steady during uncertainty becomes a kind of psychological anchor. Quiet people are not always calm, of course. Many experience intense anxiety, overthinking, or emotional conflict beneath the surface. Yet those who have learned to regulate their internal reactions often possess an influence that is difficult to explain because it doesn't rely on dominance. They don't control the room by becoming louder. They subtly change the room by becoming harder to emotionally move. This distinction matters because emotional stability is surprisingly persuasive. When two people disagree, observers don't judge only the strength of each argument. They also evaluate how each person handles pressure. Someone who becomes increasingly reactive may unintentionally communicate insecurity, even if their reasoning is sound. Meanwhile, someone who remains composed while carefully choosing each response often appears more credible before they've even finished speaking. Our brains have evolved to associate controlled behavior with competence because, throughout history, losing emotional control in dangerous situations frequently carried serious consequences. This doesn't mean calm people are always right. They certainly aren't. But perception is shaped by more than facts alone. We instinctively pay attention to those who appear least controlled by the emotional currents affecting everyone else. That is why the quiet individual who finally speaks after listening through an entire disagreement often commands immediate attention. Their silence has already communicated that they were evaluating rather than competing. Their words feel less like another opinion and more like a considered conclusion. Yet perhaps the greatest source of misunderstanding comes from the assumption that quiet people lack ambition or confidence. We often confuse confidence with visibility because confidence is easiest to recognize when it announces itself. But genuine confidence frequently looks remarkably ordinary. It doesn't always need validation through constant explanation. Think about the strongest bridge you've ever crossed. It doesn't shake to prove its strength. It simply carries the weight. Likewise, some of the most self-assured individuals feel no urgency to dominate conversations because they don't depend on every interaction to confirm their worth. They are comfortable allowing others to underestimate them, and this willingness creates an unexpected advantage. Underestimation changes the behavior of everyone around you. People reveal strategies they would otherwise hide. Competitors become careless. Colleagues speak more openly. Acquaintances expose opinions they might have concealed if they believed they were being carefully evaluated. In many ways, being underestimated functions like social camouflage. It reduces defensive behavior in others while increasing the amount of authentic information available for observation. History repeatedly demonstrates that individuals and organizations often fail not because their opponents were stronger, but because they misunderstood them. They mistook quiet preparation for inactivity. They confused patience with passivity. They interpreted the absence of obvious movement as the absence of intention. The same mistake occurs every day in ordinary relationships. Someone assumes their quiet partner doesn't notice repeated disrespect because they rarely argue, only to discover months later that every incident had been remembered. A manager mistakes a reserved employee for someone lacking leadership potential until that employee calmly solves a crisis that louder personalities only discussed. A group dismisses the classmate who rarely speaks, unaware that while everyone else competed for attention, that person had quietly developed skills no one thought to look for. These moments feel sudden only because observers mistake visible behavior for total behavior. The invisible parts of human psychology are often the ones shaping outcomes long before anyone becomes aware of them. Perhaps this explains why silence has fascinated philosophers, military strategists, negotiators, and psychologists for centuries. Silence is never merely the absence of sound. It changes how people think. It slows impulsive reactions, invites projection, encourages disclosure, exposes discomfort, and creates space where hidden motives become easier to detect. At the same time, silence can also hide pain, fear, loneliness, or unresolved trauma. This is why assuming that every quiet person is wise would be just as inaccurate as assuming every quiet person is weak. The behavior itself tells us remarkably little. What matters is the psychological process producing that silence. Is it driven by confidence or fear? Curiosity or withdrawal? Reflection or emotional exhaustion? Two people can appear equally quiet while living entirely different internal realities. And learning to recognize that difference may be one of the most valuable skills we can develop because it forces us to stop judging human beings by the volume of their voices and start paying attention to the far more revealing patterns that exist beneath them. Perhaps the most surprising discovery about quiet people has nothing to do with them at all. It has to do with us. The discomfort we often feel around someone who reveals very little is not created by their silence alone. It emerges from the collision between their silence and our own need for certainty. Human beings are storytellers by nature. The brain is constantly constructing narratives that explain why people behave the way they do because an explanation, even an imperfect one, feels safer than admitting we simply don't know. The moment someone becomes difficult to read, that storytelling machinery accelerates. We begin searching for clues everywhere. We replay conversations, analyze facial expressions, assign meaning to pauses that may have meant nothing, and interpret neutral behavior through the lens of our own experiences. If we've been betrayed before, quietness can look suspicious. If we've been ignored, it can feel rejecting. If we admire intelligence, it can seem profound. In every case, our interpretation says as much about our own history as it does about the person we're observing. This is known in psychology as projection, the tendency to attribute our own expectations, fears, motives, or emotional patterns to someone else when the available information is incomplete. Projection is not a flaw reserved for a few people. It is a universal feature of the human mind. We all do it. The difference lies only in how aware we become of it. Quiet individuals unintentionally expose this tendency because they leave enough empty space for our assumptions to echo back at us. In that sense, they function less like locked books and more like clear glass. We look through them and accidentally see ourselves. That realization changes the entire question. Instead of asking, why are quiet people so dangerous? We begin asking, dangerous to what? The answer is not necessarily our safety. More often, it is our certainty, our assumptions, our confidence that we can instantly understand another human being. They remind us that people are infinitely more complex than first impressions allow. They expose how easily we mistake confidence for competence, talkativeness for honesty, friendliness for trustworthiness, or silence for weakness. They reveal how often we reward those who communicate most persuasively rather than those who observe most carefully. And perhaps most importantly, they challenge one of the deepest illusions in modern life, the belief that constant expression always leads to deeper understanding. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the person revealing the least is learning the most. Sometimes the conversation everyone remembers for its brilliant speeches was actually shaped by the individual who spent most of it listening. Sometimes the strongest response is the one delayed long enough to escape the grip of immediate emotion. None of this means that quietness is a virtue in itself. Silence can protect wisdom, but it can also protect fear. It can create space for insight, but it can also create distance that slowly erodes relationships. Healthy communication still requires vulnerability, honesty, and the courage to speak when something truly matters. The real lesson is not to become quieter. It is to become more intentional, to recognize that every word spent carelessly reveals more than we realize, while every moment of genuine attention teaches more than we usually notice. The people who leave the deepest impression on our lives are rarely those who simply talked the most or remain the quietest. They are the ones who understood when each was appropriate. They knew when to ask instead of assume, when to observe instead of react, when to pause instead of defend, and when a few carefully chosen words could accomplish what hundreds never could. The next time you find yourself sitting across from someone who speaks very little, resist the temptation to rush toward an explanation. Don't immediately decide they're shy, arrogant, insecure, brilliant, unfriendly, or wise. Watch longer. Listen more carefully. Pay attention not only to what they say, but also to how your own mind responds to what they don't say. You may discover that the most revealing psychology in the room isn't hidden inside the quiet person at all. It's unfolding inside the observer trying so desperately to understand them. And once you recognize that, silence stops being something to fear or romanticize. It becomes something far more valuable. A reminder that the deepest truths about human nature are rarely found in the loudest voices, but in the unseen processes shaping every thought, every judgment, and every relationship long before a single word is ever spoken. If there is one lasting perspective worth carrying forward, it is this. The real danger of quiet people has never been that they possess mysterious powers or hidden intentions that others lack. The real danger is that they expose how dependent most of us have become on appearances when trying to understand reality. We live in a world that constantly rewards visibility. Social media encourages us to broadcast our thoughts before we've fully formed them. Meetings often favor whoever speaks first rather than whoever has observed the most. Confidence is displayed, attention is measured, opinions are announced, and silence is frequently mistaken for absence. Yet the human mind has never worked that simply. Every person you meet is living inside an internal world that no amount of conversation can fully reveal. There are fears that never become sentences, ambitions that remain invisible for years, memories that quietly shape every decision, and patterns of thought that even the person experiencing them may struggle to explain. The quiet individual merely reminds us of a truth that applies to everyone. What is visible is only a fraction of what is real. The greatest mistakes in relationships, leadership, business, and everyday life often begin the moment we believe we have someone completely figured out. From that point forward, curiosity disappears. We stop listening. We stop noticing change. We replace observation with assumption. And assumptions, no matter how convincing they feel, are often the fastest route to misunderstanding. The most emotionally intelligent people are not those who can instantly read everyone they meet. They're the ones who remain curious long after everyone else believes the mystery has been solved. They understand that people evolve, contradict themselves, surprise themselves, and reveal different parts of their character under different circumstances. They know that true understanding is not a destination reached after one conversation, but an ongoing process of careful attention. In that sense, quiet people offer an unexpected gift. They slow down our judgments. They force us to tolerate uncertainty instead of rushing toward easy conclusions. They reveal how much of social life is shaped not by what others actually do, but by the stories we instinctively create to explain them. And once you begin noticing those stories, something remarkable happens. You become less interested in labeling people and more interested in understanding them. You start recognizing that the loudest voice is not always the strongest, that the fastest answer is not always the wisest, and that the person saying the least may simply be waiting until their words can genuinely add something worth hearing. More importantly, you begin turning that same awareness inward. You notice how often you speak to reduce your own discomfort rather than to communicate. You catch yourself filling silence with unnecessary explanations, reacting before thinking, mistaking certainty for accuracy, or assuming you know another person's motives without enough evidence. That awareness is where real psychological growth begins, not in becoming quieter or louder, but in becoming more conscious of the invisible forces guiding your own behavior. Because in the end, the most powerful people are rarely defined by the volume of their voices. They are defined by the quality of their attention, the discipline of their emotions, the patience of their judgment, and the wisdom to recognize that every human being is more complex than they first appear. The moment you truly understand that, you stop fearing silence, you stop worshiping confidence, and you stop confusing appearances with character. Instead, you begin seeing people as they really are, not as the stories your mind creates in the first few moments, but as endlessly unfolding psychological landscapes that reveal themselves only to those willing to observe with humility, think with patience, and listen beyond the words.